Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Talking Point. My name is Faraz Patel. We're coming to you live from Hilaal TV, channel 347 on DSTV. We say Jazakallah, we say thank you for joining us. Today we are discussing coalition governments. The question we ask ourselves is, even though on face value it may be one way of governing the country, right? But just like every supposed governing factor, there's always going to be cons to it. One of those cons we saw just this past week when Dr. Mpopalatse was voted out as the mayor of the city of Johannesburg. We will be diving deep into that. But the question we ask ourselves is, come 2024, will coalition governments be able to work on a national scale? Let me introduce my guest to you to discuss this. I'd like to welcome Tessa Dwins. She's a director at Rivonia Circle. I have Sandile Swana. He's a political analyst. And I have Minaj Gina. He is the executive director at My Vote Counts. Good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Minaj, I want to start off with you, and especially with regards to the electoral amendment bill. We, of course, saw the Constitutional Court ruling with regards to that, but there are a few flaws that, of course, your organization and so many others have pointed towards. Just in summary, in about 3 minutes, discuss some, maybe just highlight some of those, and especially the ones where it concerns, of course, citizens and their role in trying to hold their leaders accountable.
Um, uh, Thanks for having me, Faraz. I just want to give some context to the amendment bill. So about 2.5 years ago, the Constitutional Court ruled the Electoral Act, the act that governs how we vote and who we vote for, is unconstitutional because it doesn't allow for individuals to contest general elections, so provincial and national elections. And the Constitutional Court gave Parliament 2 years to reform the Electoral Act. The 2 years expired in June this year. The Parliament then asked for an extension, and they were granted a 6-month extension. So the deadline is mid-December this year to reform the Electoral Act to allow for individuals to contest elections. The process that Parliament undertook has been deeply flawed and deeply inadequate. And that's fundamentally the problem with where we are now. So like all such pieces of legislation, Parliament has to go through a public participation process. Parliament says they have been through a public participation process, but the process was deeply inadequate. Part of the public participation process includes public hearings, provincially in communities. Parliament held provincial public hearings, but gave no notice for these hearings. So the hearings were filled with ANC members, EFF members who were saying the same thing. The Minister of Home Affairs, who was mandated to go through this process, appointed a ministerial advisory committee to advise the minister and Parliament on routes to take to reform the electoral process. The advisory committee then came up with two proposed reports: a majority report, so a report that majority members of the advisory committee voted for, and a minority report, a report that the minority voted for. The Minister of Home Affairs completely ignored the majority report, which very seriously considered reform, which very seriously considered what's called a constituency-based system, and just took forward the minority report, which didn't consider serious reform and simply allowed for individuals to contest elections. And what Parliament is sitting with now is an amendment bill that's been through this deeply flawed and inadequate process, and it doesn't consider serious reform. It's supposed to allow for individuals or independent candidates to contest general elections, but it doesn't really do this. It has various calculations that supposed to give credibility to independent candidates, but it disadvantages them quite a bit. And that's so fundamentally there are two flaws for us. The first flaw is that the process has been inadequate, and the second flaw is that amendment bill that we're sitting with currently and that Parliament is in all probability going to adopt because political parties don't want the power to be challenged by communities. The amendment bill itself is flawed.
While that sits in Parliament, and I'm going to bring you in, Tessa, we saw last week events that happened, of course, in the City of Johannesburg Council. Dr. Mpopalazi, of course, removed as the mayor of Johannesburg. Those who, of course, supposedly question how this was done will still have their doubts about it. But this is democracy, isn't it? And this is how coalitions work, where on one day, everything can change for you.
Yeah, I think the reason why the electoral amendment process and electoral reform conversation is important is actually exemplified in what we're seeing in the local government coalition arrangements, is that political bosses and political party bosses have way too much power. So what we've seen at a City of Joburg level is that even the politicians who were in many cases directly elected by people and were elected to serve particular communities and this particular part of South Africa, the decisions about what happens to this coalition have been made by the party bosses. They've been made by the people who lead at national level. So you see a Helen Ziller, a John Steenhuisen getting involved, Herman Mashaba, who's not in the council, even though people associate him with Joburg politics. But those are the people who are busy jostling. We've heard the name of I think his name's called Name Mulder from the FF Plus, mentioned so many times.
Plus, yes.
None of those people are actually sitting in the Joburg Council. Yet the party boss has the ability to tell the councillor what to do, to tell people what to do at a local level where they shouldn't have a say. And so part of the reason why it's really important for us to think about what kind of electoral system we are using is about asking how do we decentralize power away from party bosses, because they've abused this power in many different instances. We've seen it at the national level previously, where we saw the ANC, even when they were squabbling amongst each other about Jacob Zuma's presidency, still closing ranks because they're following the party line. We need to start thinking about how we decentralize that, and we make sure that we as the citizens, the voters, the people who have put people to represent us, actually get them to represent us and not their party interests. And so what are the implications for this? If we just talk about firstly the electoral reform bill, is that if we went for a constituency-based model, and if we had more people who were directly your councillor or directly your constituency representative, it means that you have more power to tell that person how they should vote on any given day, including the day that a mayor is being elected. And that's the kind of power that we need within our system. And this opportunity with bringing in independent candidates actually gives us the opportunity to get that kind of system if parliamentarians actually allowed it. But the reason why they're blocking it or making it difficult for independent candidates to contest, because they still want to retain their party boss power. Coalitions are not going to work if we have petty politics and people who are controlling their parties at the helm, trying to make sure that they control every single thing. Coalitions are going to work only if parties beforehand see themselves as representing people and actually take in people's input around the ways in which those agreements must be structured. Coalitions only work when those agreements are actually public. Right now, that City of Joburg agreement that the DA is up in arms about and saying can't be changed, we don't even have sight of it as the public, because they don't see us as real parts of that system. And so we have to start getting our coalition politics is the first step to getting it right, is making sure that people get more of a voice and more representation. The second step is to having a process of building a coalition that involves the public, that involves voters, that has transparency in it, and that shows that the interests that are being served are not the party boss interests, but the interests of the voters themselves.
And we are going to touch on that with regards to constituencies and whether that can be something that can work, and how do we bring independent candidates into this? Before we go to the break, Sandile, I want to bring you into this. Looking at, of course, what happened at the Johannesburg Council last week, the role of smaller parties in this. Tessa makes a very important point that the big party bosses make the decision. So what about the smaller parties like your Al Jama, like your Patriotic Alliance, and other parties who are there, who were voted by the citizens to be their representatives within the Joburg Council, or any other council for that matter?
Yes, I think that the calculation of power in these councils, and certainly the Joburg Council, was very poor, because the DA, probably for some unwise reason, could not see that the PA can actually kick them out. On this other issue, to add to what Tessa is doing, there's something that has not been discussed in this whole thing. I think part of the problem that Gayton McKenzie, especially, and others that you've mentioned, are facing in this coalition. Tessa talks about big party bosses, but I think it's deeper than that. If I were to be almost crude in how I explain this, I think the DA, which is one of the so-called bigger parties, sees this whole thing almost like a tricameral parliament that we had in the early 80s.
Yes.
They approach these politics as Bandustan politics. And I think one of the reasons why the DA is failing in these coalitions, in one small segment, but there are other segments, is that they came into this thing as people who have mastered the colored community. And those insults that were directed at Gayton McKenzie and the PA and all that, because this thing that actually happened in Joburg did not happen this week, by the way. It has a long history of conflict. And that conflict speaks to the profile and the person of Gayton McKenzie. And I think it was also an insult, perhaps even to the colored communities. And the last thing that I will say about this is that Gayton McKenzie may have very few seats, I think 2, in fact, in Joburg. But those seats are very different from other seats. Those are ward seats. Those are not proportional representation like what the EFF has got, or what the Action SA has. Those two have got no wards. Gayton McKenzie actually represents actual people. And when you insult him, actually that insult should ideally go very deep. So those are some of the problems, what you might even call it, the monopolization of power and white supremacy that also says I can dictate to everybody else. And the problems of the ANC that Jesse Duarte was also talking about, to the extent that there's a certain ethnic chauvinism whereby other ethnic groups may be to a degree be oppressed and excluded in certain processes, where the so-called Africans dominate everything else to the exclusion of every other person. And lastly, ideas of Stalinism, whereby you govern everybody with an iron fist. So that ruling by these so-called 2 big parties has played a role in actually destabilizing coalitions that did not need any destabilizing.
Yeah, well, after the break, we're going to be touching on the constituencies and how citizens, especially those in communities where service delivery is not happening, can hold their leaders to account. To stay tuned to Talking Point. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Talking Point. My name is Faraz Patel. We are discussing coalition governments and can there be a longevity for it, not just in the metros and municipalities, but also come the 2024 national elections. Guys, for this segment, I want to talk about accountability mechanisms, and I want to start with you, Sandile. If we have, of course, an independent candidate and we have him serving in that specific community, what the simple citizen wants is the basic service delivery, where he can pick up the phone and he can say, I need you to deliver on this because there's not a service delivery that is being fulfilled. And if you don't deliver on that, I will vote you out. Can we have that in South Africa? Can we have a possibility where communities are involved in making sure that the accountability is there for their leaders?
Yes, we can have that. And it's important that we promote that idea. So in our law as it exists, and there's a lot of room for improvement, you can have a ward committee, and the election process of that ward committee is very important, so that it's not the ward councillor and his or her buddies who make up the ward committee. And then that ward committee then participates and leads the planning process, the budgeting process, the IDP process, so that whatever eventually goes to the plans of the municipality comes from the ground. And then we hold each other accountable based on a plan that was already agreed. And I must say that even in my area where I live, which is within Mogale City, you know, for 3 years, we didn't have a ward committee because the speaker decided for some reason to abolish ward committees or to put them, to suspend them. And then you ask yourself, what are you running the municipality on if the citizens have got nothing to say? So the standing of the ward councillor, the ward committee, and the standing of the individual residents, we've got WhatsApp groups these days and so on, and people are following up. That is not to say councillors are still not running away from accountability. And the last thing I must say about this is that when a person becomes a politician, whether it's a councillor, a PR councillor, a ward councillor, an MP, or a member of the provincial legislature, we need to understand, as I sit here today, I need to understand that any politician is my equal. In other words, as I sit here today, Ramaphosa is my equal. Gwede Mandasha is my equal. Helen Zille is my equal. Any politician is my equal. The minute we make politicians to be our gods, then we're not going to hold them accountable.
Tessa, I want to bring you into this and ask you a very similar question about accountability mechanisms and just how can this work? How can we hold those leaders really to make sure that the basic service delivery, which is outlined in the Constitution, can be fulfilled? Because we look at so many communities and they lack, those basic needs.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about basic services, it's easy to get fixated on the local government level where service implementation needs to be happening. But where we need to actually ramp this up, because at the local level, because we have the option of direct representation, and this is not only with independent candidates, it's also with just ward councillors, even if they represent a party. We have a lot more leverage. And somebody pointed out to me before the local government election, when we were doing some vote education work in Diepsloot, that there's actually no proper line for recall. So even though we can directly elect, right now there's no proper line and proper process for directly recalling. So that's one of the things we can start to fix. And we can fix that at the local government level, but we certainly need to think about at the provincial and the national level what that looks like. Because at this point, people feel like putting down their ex is useless because after the fact, they have no say about the people that go into there. Right now, we even have a closed list system when it comes to provincial and national, which means that we don't even have to, parties don't even have to engage us properly on who the people are they put onto those lists. The party internal has the final say on who's on their list and who goes into parliament. It's the reason why most South Africans don't even know who their parliamentarians are. Never mind if they're going to recall them or not. Never mind if they're going to vote for them in the right kinds of policies and laws. They don't even know who they are. Worse yet, we have a constituency system right now, but it's a fake constituency system. Because Parliament just says to parties, just use your imagination and divide the country up into constituencies of your choice, which means that somebody who lives in Constantia in Cape Town can be the constituency member of parliament for Eldorado Park. It's inconceivable that will actually work, that even just basic accountability, like you were saying, picking up the phone and saying, hey, there's a vote in parliament next week on the water bill. This is the way I want you to vote. What will that constituency MP for Eldorado Park care what the Eldorado Park citizens say if they don't even live there?
Yes.
Something we really need to rethink is how closely connected people who represent us are to us. So one of the things is about geography and making sure that you actually live close to people who you represent. It's a very basic thing. At a local government level, it matters because when my water and my sanitation and my lights are not working, that means also yours, Mr. Ward Councillor, is also not working. So the level of inconvenience is shared. But if you're going to live in Constantia Kloof as an MP, of course you're not going to care when I don't have the kind of things that I need in terms of service delivery. And the other thing about it is really making sure there's meaningful participation in the process. So earlier Manaj was talking about, Parliament had to, by law, go and do public participation processes. The reason, again, why we can have entire processes like that happening and the majority of the country don't know is because there's no MPs that are actually supposed to go to a constituency and make sure they know about it. They're not held to high enough standards, and we can change that. We can change that by the way we vote and the electoral system, and we must demand that change because it's in our best interest to be able to do that.
Manoj, I want to bring you into this very same part of the segment. Sandile made a good point that we need to treat politicians as our equal, and that is, of course, bounded by the Constitution. And then what Tessa's saying also that, so many people in so many communities do not know who's representing them in parliament or who's representing them in the provincial legislature, who's representing them in the city council. What my vote count obviously wants to see is, from your organizational perspective, is that there is a familiarity with who's representing you. And of course, you can also at the same time hold them to account if certain things are not being delivered, and those certain things are the basic service delivery that you as a citizen of South Africa deserves to have.
For us, I just want us to move away from the fixation on service delivery. I think fundamentally democracy is not about the delivery of service, and the fact that political parties, especially around local government elections, are allowed to fixate their campaigns on this thing that they call service delivery is a problem. I think democracy is about people's ability to govern. It's about people having a real and meaningful say in decisions made about them, not just during elections, but through the entire democratic process. So I think we need to shift our understanding of what representation means, and what the role of public representatives are. I think Tessa is right. It's fundamentally about representation, and we need to ask what that means. It's difficult in South Africa because majority of people's political identity has been and is still associated with a political party, and we haven't been able to extend our political identities beyond that. If we look at protests, for example, as you mentioned, this frustrations within communities. We have several a day, according to many stats. Most of these protests are not fundamentally about service delivery. They're about other issues. They're about ANC nationalism. They're about the breakdown of communication in relation to tenders. So I think it is important for us to speak about service delivery, but it's secondary. I think primarily it's about representation, and for me, it actually is important when we speak about representation. The other point that I want to touch on is Tessa's point on the closed list system. I think this is a big problem, especially at general, national, and provincial elections. What happens is political party bosses, and not parties themselves, develop these lists, and they can recall and put people on these lists whenever they want. And we vote for political parties, but we don't necessarily know who is going to represent these political parties in parliament. So I think in addition to electoral reform, one of the fundamental problems is how parties, which are always going to be here, operate. Currently, if you look in terms of legislation, how parties operate and how parties exist, they exist like a tennis club in Constantia would exist. There's no legislation, no political culture to force parties to be democratic, to force parties to be transparent and accountable, and to force parties to have representatives that represent people in community.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point right over there that you've put in there, Minaj. How do we make sure that democracy and just the basic governing of wherever it is, be it communities or anywhere else, will be able to function? Well, after the break, we will go ahead and continue this conversation on coalition governments and whether it can work. And we will be touching on coalition governments in the next segment, so do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. Our discussion tonight is with regards to coalition governments and can they work in South Africa. My guests are Tessa Duan, Sandile Swana, and Minaj Gina. Tessa, there's of course the famous saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We saw that last week in the Johannesburg Council. And then of course, when coalition government started getting in, of course, starting to make its waves within the metros, a lot of it, of course, led by the DA and the EFF, were to try and get the ANC out. Of course, big political parties and their egos would do that, of course, get the ANC out. But then they would, of course, forget to go ahead and govern. And of course, that's what people are looking for there to be a party that can govern, lead them, and of course, deliver on the promises that they had made pre-elections. Do citizens need to have that fear that, of course, you have these political parties kicking the ANC out, but they're forgetting to govern and forgetting to lead them, and of course, forgetting to fulfill the promises that were made before the elections?
Listen, voters and people in South Africa at large have a legitimate fear about what happens if the ANC is removed from power, especially at the national level, because we've only known a one-state party dominance since 1994 at the national level. And we have also seen some horror stories. But we must also remember, from the 2021 elections came 66 hung councils across the country. There are 66 instances of coalitions right now in the country. And yes, the big metros are where we focus our attention on. But we must also think about where things are working. And those are usually in the smaller councils where the resource fights are not as big, and where you can see that parties are a bit more reasonable about the ways in which they think things need to happen for stability. I mean, there's a council in this country that is has as its mayor an independent candidate. So surely there are lessons to be learned from things we are already doing in the country about how to run effective coalitions. And I think part of it is about how closely located government and the people who are in power are to ordinary South Africans and to communities. I think that makes a big difference in terms of how accountable people feel. So in the bigger metros, people feel more removed. They feel like they have less accountability, and that's why more gets messed up. But I do think we need to think about the 2024 elections and coalitions with less fear and trepidation. Firstly, because coalition governments may be a newish phenomena in the South African context, but the world over, there are coalition governments that produce amazing results. We see in many European contexts where coalitions are actually the order of the day. I think in Sweden, they've only had an outright winner of an election maybe once since World War II. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing, which means that coalitions can work. But we must think about the rules of engagement for coalitions. We can think about legislation, and that's something that we can process before the 2024 elections without much fanfare. and say, how should we make sure that coalitions are negotiated well, are run well, people have a sense of accountability, and people have a sense of input to create the kind of stability that's necessary. Because the one thing that is going to be important to remember is we can't wish away coalitions. Neither can we wish for coalitions. Coalitions are an outcome of an election result. As individual voters, when we go to the voting station, we can't predict that there's going to be a coalition. Nobody goes and votes for and puts then X next to coalition. The coalition is a result. And when you have that result, as politicians, they may like it, they may not like it. We may like it, we may not like it as the voter. But if that's the result that the voting process gives us, we must make the best of that result. Trying to say to people, don't vote for coalitions is a meaningless thing. It's simple political rhetoric that doesn't go anywhere. We must say to people, we must plan for coalitions if they are an eventuality, and when they happen, we must make sure they work as best as possible.
Minaj, I want to come to you. As Tessa mentioned, the 66 hung councils and so many of them that work quite effectively, that should give the voter some sort of confidence that, look, in those hung councils where you remove away the egos and so many other factors, there can be something that can function.
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, Tessa is right. The fact that 24 years into democracy, we're only starting to see coalitions is an exception to how democracies work. It's not the norm. Multi-party democracies across the world are run and have always been run by coalitions. So coalition is the new norm of how politics will work in the future. And we have to accept that, and we have to figure out how to build accountability frameworks around them. And I think coalitions do in this moment that we're in of chaos. I think coalitions can work to our, when I say our, I mean citizens' advantages. It does allow us to hold people we put into government accountable. It does allow us to use the vote strategically to, for example, vote for smaller parties who will have more power in coalitions than they would have with a majority government. It does allow us to put parties against each other. So not necessarily vote for parties that we like the best, but for parties that politically and strategically make sense to vote for, because we can get what we want by voting for them. So I think that is important. I think going into 2024 and beyond, we have to realize that in all probability, based on local government elections last year, based on the results of by-elections, the ANC is likely to lose its majority, and we are likely to see some sort of coalition government. We don't know for sure, and nobody knows at all. And based on previous elections and elections across the world, polling has not been entirely accurate, but it does seem likely that we will see coalitions. I think the problem in South Africa, and why I suspect that there will be chaos if we are to have a coalition, is that we don't have very real alternatives. We don't have a government in the waiting. We have the ANC that's failing absolutely, but there's no alternative to the ANC. If you look at the local government elections last year, we had a steep dip in the number of people that voted, and that's not because of voter apathy. And the evidence shows that that's primarily because the people who previously voted for the ANC decided to withhold their vote. And they decided to withhold their vote because they see no alternative to the ANC. And right now, there still is no alternative to the ANC, and I doubt we're going to see an alternative to the ANC by 2024. So all we can do now is use our vote strategically as we move towards 2024. But also at the same time, we need to consider what this alternative looks like. And there are many dangers. Currently, we're seeing alternatives in the form of Action SA, right-wing parties like Action SA and the Patriotic Alliance, who are campaigning, organizing, using anti-foreign sentiment, which is being picked up by other political parties as well. So that's the danger. The danger is, well, there is this hole in our politics. But who is it and what is it being filled by? So while we think about how to use our vote strategically as we move towards 2024, we also need to think about how we fill the hole in our politics.
Well, after the break, Sandile, I am going to ask you two questions. Probably you can answer it in one. After the break, to wrap up, can coalitions work come 2024? And one, of course, to Minaj, when we do come after the break, the voter roll. Are we going to see a higher voter turnout? What's the hope that potentially coalition governments could be the way to go come the next general elections? Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. We are heading into our final segment. Sandile, I want to bring you in quickly. Egos will always be there amongst the politicians. We've seen it for so many years. Can these egos allow for there to be a coalition government in 2024, given the frustration of the people, given that, based on statistics, the ANC are on the road to losing their majority?
Thank you. As has been already pointed out, there are certain leaders, even in local municipalities, and I don't know what provincial and national, where a person is rooted and highly respected and gets appointed as the mayor, regardless of which political party they belong to. It has already happened. So we need to accept that even our political parties generally, here in Gauteng and nationally, the issue of merit when we are forming a coalition, to say, here we are 5 parties forming this coalition. Could it even be possible that the person who can be president of this country is not even in the room? Can we find that merit? The other thing that we need to get rid of is this idea that there are no alternative political parties, because that idea is manufactured in this way. For instance, when the DA participated in the previous elections for Johannesburg, for Ekurhuleni, were they presenting themselves as an alternative government? Did it occur to their mind, seriously occur to their mind, that actually there's a job to be done here? We can be the alternative government to the ANC. So for as long as generally all of us, the commentators, the actual political party leaders, do not see themselves as alternative, that is something we generate in our own minds. It's not an objective fact. We generate it in our own minds. What made the ANC ready to govern in 1994, to take over from what was, these guys were jumping out of the bush and out of prison. What made them so ready to govern? So I think that we need to be very careful where the self-confidence of the various politicians and political parties and need to be examined right now in 2022, so that by 2024, people know that votes can come out that demand them to lead a province such as Gauteng, a province such as KZN, or even lead the nation. And lastly, we must understand that, and William Gumede has done the study, that actually when you look at African history, the most successful form of government was actually the coalition government in Mauritius. There is no other country that has succeeded more than that, and it was a coalition government. And we need to get rid of this doctrine that the National Party put us in, taking from 1948 to 1994, a one party all the way, killing everybody, blackmaling everybody, and doing all sorts of things to us. And then the ANC followed exactly on the same route. Just the statement, when you talk about egos and monopoly of power, Why do you say if you've joined the ANC, you can't, whilst you're already in the ANC, have a conscience that you are going to vote according to your conscience? You can't vote. If you're in the ANC, you don't vote according to your conscience. All of those things, before you even talk about coalition, it means that the very people who've joined these parties are not free. And now the advent of coalitions are opening up new doors for freedom. And people have to accept that responsibility can fall on their lap and they need to be ready for it.
Tessa, Minaj, I'm going to give you a minute each to just get your closing remarks. Tessa, you wrote an article in the Sowetan about voter turnout. Coalition governments, can we see it in 2024 with voter turnout? Are we going to see the two collating with each other come 2024?
Yeah, so as Manoj said earlier, all the trends are saying that the ANC could go below 50 for the first time. And the thing that would bolster the ANC is a low voter turnout. In fact, because, as Manoj said, a lot of people who are deciding not to vote are withholding their vote from the ANC. A lot of traditional ANC voters have not come to the polls. And I think that part of the magic of 2024 is going to be about getting people mobilized to vote and to make decisions and to look at all of these options, because what coalitions have taught us, and again, we can look at the city of Joburg, is that every single vote matters in our system. It's not a winner takes all system. It's not once you get about 50%, all other votes don't matter anymore. Actually, because of our multi-party system and because of coalitions, even a party that gets one seat, we can see it with the speaker of COPE. COPE has one seat in that council, but has been able to do many things because those votes matter. And so we must think about how we drive turnout. In the US, we've seen in Georgia, a state that has been Republican for many, many years, because organizations like the one that we're hosting on Saturday at our engagement, the New Georgia Project, they focused on young voters, Black voters, Hispanic voters, people who had not voted before traditionally, and said to them, if we start having conversations with each other about what the future can look like, what our vote can mean, who we're going to vote for, what we're going to vote about, we can be a voting bloc that changes the country. And that's how Joe Biden won that election, because Georgia flipped. So we must not take for granted that every vote is going to count. And we must start thinking very hard towards 2024 about what we're going to do, because it can be one vote that determines which party is going to swing this election in one direction or the other, or form coalitions.
Minaj, your closing remarks?
I think Tessa is right, but I think it's going to be incredibly difficult given the current political context. A recent Afrobarometer study showed that South Africans have very little trust in in every single public institution, especially in Parliament. I think it's like 27% in Parliament have trust in Parliament, especially in the President, even in the IEC, even in the judiciary, and especially in political parties. I think in general it's all below 30 or 35%. So it's not just about getting people to believe in voting. It's about getting people to believe in democratic institutions, which most people, almost 70% of people, don't believe in. I think 2024 does present an opportunity for South Africans, for voters, but I don't believe that if the ANC is to lose majority, it will renew party politics, or it will necessarily empower voters. I think we have a long way to go before we can renew our politics and empower voters. I think we do need an alternative to the ANC. Currently, there's no party that has captured the imagination of, for example, the Black middle class. There is no party on a political left who in a real way represents the needs and the politics of the impoverished, of people on the margins, and that's what we need. But that's a long-term project. So my closing remarks towards 2024, we need people to vote, but we need people to vote strategically.
And that's going to be important. You in a democracy, make sure that your vote counts. And come 2024, wow, it's going to be one of those elections that could change the future and the road for South Africa. I'd like to thank my guest, Tessa Doans, Director at Rivonia Circle, Sandile Swana, he's a political analyst, and Minaj Gina, the Executive Director at My Vote Counts. We say Jazakallah to all of you. We say thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, and to you as the viewer for joining us for the last 1 hour. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the production team here at Talking Point on Hilaal TV, we say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and we'll see you again next week, same time, same place.